Good morning. I apologize that we're a few minutes late. I was giving some folks some extra time to get here, but we're going to start up anyways. First of all, my name is Vic Manjarres. I'm the director of the Center for Law and Human Behavior here at UTEP. And so the Symposium series is part of our center and under the REACH program at UTEP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call up her presentation, and I will welcome Dr. Jillian Turanovic.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you for Vic for that introduction and for organizing this. So, like he said, I'm a professor at Florida State University in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and it really is such an honor to be here presenting in front of you all today. Thank you to the Center for Criminal Justice and the department for inviting me and just allowing me to share this research with you all. I've had a great time visiting El Paso so far. I've been eating a lot of food, so much food, and it's just been wonderful to visit the campus. And so thank you, all of you. I know your schedules are extremely busy. You have very important and demanding jobs. And so I just really value so greatly the time that you took here today out of your schedules to be here. And two, given the topic, I'm very sensitive to the fact that your community experienced a horrific deadly mass shooting in 2019. And so I know this topic really hits close to home for many of you and for your community. So in this talk, I'm going to be giving an overview of a research project that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of the Department of Justice, that we just completed to compile a comprehensive database on deadly mass shootings that have happened in the US between 1980 and 2019, which include those occurring in both public and private spaces. So hopefully today I can just provide an overview and some more insights onto the broader scope of the mass shooting problem and the nature of the data that we collected in this study and why, to hope that we can just learn more about this really complex and very difficult topic. Okay, so as we all know, deadly mass shootings have emerged as one of the most prominent social problems in contemporary America. And tragedies such as those that have occurred here in El Paso, in communities like Orlando, in Parkland, Las Vegas, more recently in Boulder, these are incidents that have understandably just shocked and traumatized the nation. And although these incidents account for far less than 1% of all homicides that occur in the United States, a large majority of adults experience stress over mass shootings, and a third say that the fear of these attacks stop them from going to certain places and events. And it's also clear from multiple polling sources that there's a public perception that deadly mass shootings are becoming alarmingly more frequent in recent years. So it's not uncommon to see headlines such as these in the media, where there's statements such as deadly mass shootings are on the rise, that they're spreading like a disease, that they've more than doubled since Columbine, or that they're increasing significantly. From a data and research standpoint, though, there's a concern that there may be a bit of a disconnect between the reality of these deadly incidents and how often they occur, and the public's perception of them based on media accounts. Now, I say this because although violent crime is currently on the rise, in the past several years, violent crime overall has been lower than in prior decades, such as in the 1980s and 1990s. So here you can see the violent crime rate over time, and using data from the Uniform Crime Reports from 1960 through 2020. So you can see that generally, crime rates have been decreasing since the 1990s throughout most of the 2000s. And a sociologist, Patrick Sharkey, he published a book called Uneasy Peace. And in that book, he regarded 2014 as the safest year in modern history based on violent crime rates. And so this fact is lost among most of the American public who consistently report that or perceive that crime has been on the rise since the early 2000s. So this chart kind of shows the disparity between crime rates and the public's perceptions of crime. So you can see the darker blue line reflects the percentage of Americans who think crime has increased over the past year. And the bottom line reflects the actual violent crime rate from the National Crime Victimization Survey. So you really see the lines start to diverge around 2001, post 9/11, right? So people's perceptions of crime don't always match up with reality. And research suggests that also that part of this gap as it continues over time can be due in part to the media's increasing sensationalization of crime and violence, and especially the amount of attention that and publicity that is afforded to high profile attacks in public spaces, including mass shootings. So a more serious issue, though, with thinking about the problems of mass shootings and mass violence is that we have very little in the way of what constitutes a shared definition with respect to what a mass shooting is. So contributing to some of this confusion is that existing databases on mass violence, those that are publicly available and routinely drawn from by the media and researchers too, paint widely different pictures of the mass shooting problem. So for instance, one of these data sources that is reported on a lot in media and in research is data that is compiled by Mother Jones, which is a relatively liberal news media website. And so this data set is heavily relied on by the public and the media, and they define a mass shooting as 3 or more shot and killed in a public space, not including the shooter. And that's in recent years. In the earlier years in the data, they define a mass shooting differently. So you can actually really compare the earlier years of data to the later years, where before they would defined it as 4 or more shot and killed, not including the shooter, and then in more recent years, 3 or more. But excluded from these data are a lot of instances of mass violence that occur in public spaces, those where the shooter may be unknown, or any shootings that may be motivated by other felonies, things that are drug-related, gang-related, or even revenge-related. And so, like even armed robberies and gang violence, right? They're excluded from these data. So these data show that mass shootings are more common today than they were in earlier years and show 10 incidents that have occurred in 2019, for example. Now, alternatively, another publicly available and popular data source is the Gun Violence Archive. Now, these data sets in the Gun Violence Archive define a mass shooting as 4 or more shot, not including the shooter, where non-fatal incidents are included, right? So instances where 4 or more people were shot anywhere, in any time, at any place, not including the shooter, regardless of whether any fatalities occurred. So there are no restrictions in these data placed on what is included based on why the shootings happened, and these data show that over 400 mass shootings happened in 2019. So from trying to understand the scope of this problem, the disparity between 10 and 400 is vast, and it creates mass confusion, I think, over the nature and frequency of mass shootings, especially because when we see a number like 400, what we picture is 400 Las Vegases or El Paso shootings, right? But the majority of these are non-fatal incidents. Now, the Gun Violence Archive, I don't want to slam it too much because it is a fantastic resource for any of you who are trying to track on a broader scale gun violence more in real time. Our official sources, like from the FBI or the Department of Justice, there's typically quite a lag between when those data are made available to the public. And here with the Gun Violence Archive, you can kind of track on a daily basis in real-time gun violence that is occurring in various communities. I will say, though, it's created by a bunch of algorithms. So when there's a media report that's published on on a shooting, it'll be kind of auto-populated to the data, and they have various technology that they use to populate this data source. So this is an overview of the website. You can see the various different types of violence that they track. But again, you can see in the row for mass shootings, how they appear to be increasing over time in here, and it lists like 611 that occurred in 2020. Also too though, if you're using these data, make sure that sometimes the information populates like right away after the incident before more information becomes available over time. So sometimes there are inconsistencies and a lack of reliability in some of the information that's provided, but just to give you a sense of that. Now, our sources from the FBI, when we're thinking about mass shootings and mass violence, also present quite different pictures of the problem. So the FBI Active Shooter Database is a fantastic resource for understanding attacks in public spaces. So these data include incidents where individuals are actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area with one or more firearms. And again, excluded from these data are incidents that are gang or drug-related shootings and those that maybe didn't intentionally put people's lives in danger. So these data show active shootings to be increasing in recent years, where, for example, 1 was recorded in 2020 and 28 in 2019. Now, the FBI supplemental homicide reports, which are really our nation's kind of premier source of homicide statistics, too, are not necessarily complete or accurate in the reporting of mass murders by firearm. So there are several incidents recorded in these data that are mischaracterized as mass killings. And there are also issues with the supplemental homicide reports and that participation in these data are voluntary. So not all jurisdictions report their homicides, and even in jurisdictions that do, cases are missing. My home state where I live, Florida, for instance, has never participated in the supplemental homicide reports. They have their separate Florida homicide report housed on their website. And in going through these data, trying to identify mass shootings from the supplemental homicide reports, I've came across cases where it says, okay, in South Bend, there were 8 victims killed in an incident. And I was like, I never heard about this in recent years. And I did more digging and I found that there was 1 person killed, but there's 8 suspects. There's also duplicates in the data, right? Where for high casualty events, they're listed multiple times because there's a maximum number of victims that can be listed. So it's difficult to determine, even from these amazing official data sources, mass violence and how often it occurs. So even newer mass shooting databases. So my project that I'm presenting on today was funded by the National Institute of Justice, and there's another project funded around a similar time to compile data on mass shootings, given these issues that we face with existing data sources. So this one, the Violence Project database, was pulled together by a research team, and it's great in that it captures probably the most comprehensive information on shooters themselves. But it also uses a really highly restrictive definition of what a mass shooting is. It includes only those that occur in public spaces, excludes cases where victims are family or friends of the shooter, along with shootings that are related to gangs, underlying crimes, arguments, or romantic triangles, right? So for those of you who maybe work homicide cases, comprises a lot of them. And so although these data are great, the data exclude from the conversation a lot of instances of mass violence that predominantly target women and children, such as those that occur in the home and those that occur in disenfranchised high crime communities. So altogether, really, this kind of tells us that there is no comprehensive, publicly available, and centralized database on mass shootings over time, especially during those years where crime and violence may have been generally higher, such as in the 1980s and 1990s. And we want to capture those higher crime years because to the extent that mass shootings follow similar trends, it may be that their sources in nature are rooted in similar issues that drive violence generally. But if they're following different patterns and divergent patterns, then we should really be treating them as their own separate, unique form of violence. So without accurate and complete data going back in time, it's really difficult to determine the nature and extent of the mass shooting problem. And this is consequential because any successful policy or even a fruitful discussion of what that policy might be first requires something really important, right? That we have a really good understanding of the nature of the problem itself. And it really doesn't seem like we have that currently with respect to mass shootings. So in attempts to fix or help remedy some of these issues with NIJ support, myself and a team of graduate and undergraduate students and another professor have compiled a mass shooting database to assess all deadly mass shootings in the US dating back to 1980 up through 2019. Now, the aim with this project was to identify all mass shootings over time, examine their trends and features, and also assess some of the key individual, situational, and contextual correlates of these events. In order to hopefully just provide better evidence and better informed data-driven policies. Now, given all the issues with definitions of mass shootings, I'll say we defined a mass shooting here as one in which 4 or more victims were killed by firearm in one event, right, within a 24-hour period where the count does not include the shooter. Now, this definition is consistent with the Congressional Research Service and the FBI's definition of mass murder, and this was also a definition that was provided to us by the Department of Justice. So these are only incidents that involve 4 or more fatalities. Now, in our data, we include mass shootings occurring in both public and private spaces, including those that may be tied to other crimes, gang or drug-related issues, and just basically any incident where 4 or more people were killed in a single homicide event. We compiled our data from open source records, including news reports, FBI data, all the existing databases that we could take information from. Then we had a lot of gaps to fill in. So homicide reports, court records, and these data will soon be made publicly available through the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data. But I'm also happy to share the data with anyone who wants to reach out and ask for it. So this effort has really proceeded in 3 main phases. And I will say that when we started this project, we vastly underestimated the amount of time and effort that it would take to locate and identify these incidents. When we think about a mass shooting, we think, well, we should be able to find these pretty easily because they're all high-profile homicides, but they were not, right? There's massive variability in how often certain crimes were reported on and the amount of tension and public sympathy that they got. So we really had to dig deep to find some of these incidents. I think we found them all after all of this, but it's possible we are still missing given the nature of open source data collection. So first, yes, the way that this project proceeded is we first tried to identify all mass shootings that we could, dating back to 1980. Second, after we kind of had this list, we then gathered extensive information on all of the incidents. So gathered as much as we can from the media, from official records, from law enforcement agencies, and then the third step was we coded, taking all this different information and entered into a database these different characteristics of these different incidents. And we just wrapped up, this last phase of coding and data analysis. So there's still a lot more to analyze based on all the information we gathered, but hopefully today I can provide you with at least some understanding of what the basics of some of these incidents look like, and then kind of the basics of this overall broader problem in America. So to locate incidents, we use 3 primary sources. First, existing reports and data on mass shootings, knowing, of course, that most of these are incomplete and require extra validation. Second, we relied on local, state, and national homicide reports, court records, and we reached out to many different agencies, especially at the state level, on homicide statistics. And then thirdly, news media reports. So anytime we located an incident in an existing database or report, we tried to gather additional sources of information to verify that. And triangulate information through a variety of sources as best that we could. Now, given the issues with existing data that I described previously, nothing was really automatically entered into our data if it appeared in an existing database or in a news report. So instead, we had to validate it through multiple sources and multiple news media reports. So this is kind of what our validation process looked like. We would find different leads kind of online or any of these existing databases, and then we try and verify it. If it was clear that there was 4 more victims who were shot and killed, not including the shooter, and the shootings happened on the same day, we would include it in our data set at least temporarily. Now, issues that we are facing is we would find reports of mass shootings where it would say, 4 people shot, and then later you learn, well, maybe 2 people were shot and 2 people were stabbed or strangled or burned. They were not all suffered gunshot wounds. We didn't include those in our data, given our definition. There was incidents too where there was incidents of mass murder, and again, just not all suffered gunshot wounds. If they died by other means but were shot, we included those in the data. Now, we gathered information. So once we kind of had this list of potential incidents, then we had to gather all the information that we could on this. So we tried for every single incident to validate it through official records, through police reports, through court files, especially if the shooter was being prosecuted, and knowing, of course, that some of the information, especially in the media, can change over time as more is released. So through all these different gatherings, so we tried to gather at least 100 news articles on every incident. And so we searched through a variety of databases on media reports like ProQuest through our libraries at Florida State, Access World News, newspapers.com, Google for more recent years, local news sources. And then we also did systematic searches through kind of the major news outlets. So the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and Washington Post. But the real heart of the information that we were gathering was coming from official court records and law enforcement records. So we would obtain these sources of information from like the law library, from various websites that publish court documents, and through many, many Freedom of Information Act requests directly to law enforcement agencies. And we were undergoing these searches and data gathering phases during COVID, when many agencies were just overwhelmed and at their max. Some were working remotely, and so it often took a lot of time and effort to get some of these reports, but I'm so thankful to the agencies who are able to provide and share their information with us. So after all of this information was gathered, then we developed like a detailed coding protocol to record data on each mass shooting incident. So to address issues of conflicting reports, which we did come across, we developed this kind of information hierarchy where possible, official records from courts and law enforcement agencies were used as the primary source of information for coding. And when official records were not available, we used media reports as kind of the primary source of information. And so with that, we know that those two are unequal. So we would rely on leading news sources, especially for in higher profile incidents like things published by the Associated Press, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, or from the local news outlets in the city or town where the shooting occurred. Where we could be relied on the most recent articles that were further removed from the incident, since the time lag between when the incident occurred to when it was being reported on kind of allowed the media to maybe sort out details and verify information that wasn't available in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. So the coding scheme we piloted on a subsample of incidents to determine any issues or ambiguities in the coding process. I had a team of like 14 undergraduate students that were helping code, and so we really made sure that we all understand how to code certain things in the data, and we made minor adjustments or clarifications when we needed. We met weekly to discuss these incidents, discuss just the nature of some of these cases, difficulties that we had finding information, ways to troubleshoot, And as cases were completed by coders, myself and a project manager, another PhD student at Florida State University, we independently checked and verified their cases to code for any errors or inconsistencies or correct for missing data. There's a lot of times where things just were not reported on or available. Or say, for instance, if mental health was never mentioned, we can't say that that person is coded as having a mental health problem. So the way that we recorded information in the data was if something was mentioned and verified, we include that. So there's limits, right, to this nature of data collection where some things may be just underreported on or not available. So keep that in mind as I go through this, that the open source data collection method isn't perfect, but based on what we were working with, like this is hopefully an improvement for where existing data are, which are also relying on open source records too. And for gathering this information, we were able to obtain official records for 70% of our incidents, which was pretty good. So I think I'm maybe not talking long enough, but I think we're gonna have a break now because I'm gonna, after this, tell you about what the data actually show. And we can have some of that. So does anyone have any questions or anything thus far that you want to bring up? The nature of the project? If not, we can have a little break.
More questions?
Yeah.
How did you determine the dates to research?
Okay, so we originally started, so NIJ was looking for just what decades to go back to. And for us, the supplemental homicide report started in 1976. So originally we have planned to go back to that time. The feasibility and the effort and the timeline for the grant really determined the amount of years we could include. The further back in time we went, the more effort and resources it took to find some of those cases and validate them. But I do have ongoing data going back to 1976 using the supplemental homicide reports as kind of our initial guide. And then through 2019 was kind of when we initially proposed the grant, it ended, that was kind of the time when the grant was going to begin. But we do have incidents that we're continuing to collect up through live time, but verifying those takes so much effort. So a lot of our 2019 cases are still going through the court process where there's an identified shooter. I have a student just emailed me this morning saying, one of our shootings in California that happened in 2019, there's finally a verdict in his trial and it's a mistrial. And I was like, so just the nature of the criminal justice process is slow, right? Given due process and also given COVID delays. And so I have a list of incidents that happened up through, current time. But in terms of all of the other information that we can verify and validate, I don't trust that it's complete or accurate yet. So there's a bit of a lag, but that's kind of how we determined initially the range of years where we thought 1980 was feasible to go back to. But yeah, we do have data right before that to 1976 and then up to current time, just not with all of our characteristics validated and coded yet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need a team, a big team of researchers and algorithms to find everything. Yeah.
So for asking the first question.
Yes.
So I got a couple more challenge points for any other questions for Dr.
Oh, over here. Over here.
Why is the number 4 chosen for the definition of a method?
That's a good question. I mean, this is something that the FBI has relied on for a long time to define a mass murder. And the Congressional Research Service, when they are devoting more attention to these issues, it's something that they chose. This is the cutoff for what defines an incident of mass violence. And so for our data to be comparable, this was recommended for us to use by the Department of Justice, I think, so that they can seamlessly merge some of their data on mass violence with this. But, it's it's generally quite arbitrary, because if you have 3 people shot in an incident and 1 survives, that to me should still be an incident of mass violence. But unfortunately, this was the definition and cutoff that we used. I will say too that we came across a lot of incidents like that, where maybe there were 4 people shot, but 1, survived, and we didn't include it in our data. So yeah, but I think this is at least a starting point, and an improvement over where existing data sources are. And as these data become publicly available, I hope that people can expand upon them, right? So maybe add to these different incidents, using this as the starting point, additional ones that maybe have occurred, 3 fatalities or more, even 2. Yeah.
Or injuries and 1
Sure.
death.
Exactly. Yeah. Going back in time, I will say even in these incidents where there are 4 people killed, it's very difficult to find information. And so when 4 people are shot but survive, with the nature of how we're relying on finding these data through homicide statistics or even just through media reports, especially if those victims that are shot are not, like sympathetic victims, or maybe, more affluent, or, like super innocent, or going about their day in a different way, they're not found in the media. So it would, for us, wanting to go back in time, we weren't confident either that we could reliably find non-fatal incidents through these methods. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the biggest fear factor that has been provoked by the media?
I mean, I think we can get into some of that when you see some of the characteristics of these, but I think there's a lot of, we think that these happen a lot more often than they do. Because when they do happen, they're so tragic and horrific that it really impacts, so many people's daily routines and their lives. But the reality is that these are really rare events. And the fear that is generated by, I think, the coverage of these incidents is vastly overstated. Where there's people, I've talked to, I work with victims of crime a lot in my research, and some of them are scared to just leave their homes because they're afraid, or going to a concert or going to a grocery store because there may be a mass shooting that will happen. And so, yeah, I think the fear is extreme, and the media, is the way that some of these incidents are described, is like no one is ever safe anywhere, anytime. There's other misconceptions about these incidents in that they're always carried out by assault weapons. And you'll see as I present statistics, that's not the case. The majority of them are carried out by handguns. And as well, we don't have evidence that the majority of mass shooters are mentally ill either. And so some of them are, of course, and for someone to carry out an instance of mass violence, obviously you're not in your right mind. But in terms of like preventable red flags, in terms of like mental illness, we don't see a lot of that. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. Yeah.
Do you think that now that we're having more open carry, more weapons out in the street, is that going to build?
Okay, that's a really good question. So there's research, criminologists have done research on this, and it's quite conflicting. So some research shows that the easier it is in states that have, more permissible, so where it's easier to get a gun and open carry and those types of things, or they have more permissible like regulations for how easy it is to obtain a firearm, that we see more instances of gun-related homicides, but not necessarily mass shootings. And so mass shootings don't really appear to be affected by that. Yeah. But these are, again, rare events relative to other homicides. Who's next? Okay, yes.
So you mentioned mental health.
Yes.
We noticed that that's been an increase of their excuse of perhaps saying, "Oh yeah, my child, my daughter, my whoever, my loved one, that individual had mental health issues." Have you kept track of that also?
Yeah, as best we can. Like, we have dug so deep on all of these incidents. We've had, you know, and a lot of our mental health verification is through clinical diagnoses. So if someone is, so we use that, and I'll get a little bit more into that as we keep talking about the data, but because so we have, you know, there will be media reports and there'll be like a friend or a neighbor say, oh, this person seemed, you know, to have mental health problems, or they seemed to be depressed, but I don't know if that really constitutes a diagnosable mental illness. So the way our threshold was if they had clinically diagnosed mental health problems where they were either institutionalized, they were taking psychoactive medication, or they had evidence of attempted or planned suicides. Yeah, so we use kind of that more extreme cutoff. Yeah. Oh, yes, and then, yes.
In addition to single incident shootings like the one here in El Paso, the
Yes.
one in Columbine and Parkland, do you track incidents like the DC sniper case where multiple people shot and multiple people killed, but over a longer period of time?
Yeah, so our definition is within 24 hours, but several mass shootings in our data were part of larger sprees. So maybe someone had killed they were on a crime spree where maybe one person was shot in one location, a few days later another, and then maybe a few days later a mass shooting happened. So we do track whether something was part of a spree killing. It's a little bit more rare with these data. Most of them are singular incidents. Yeah. Yes.
Is there similar factors that lead into mass shootings occurring? Similar data and everything?
With different like homicides or
Similar factors that causes why they do conduct these mass shootings, why they do conduct these crimes?
yeah. So we'll get a little bit more into that. Yeah. You'll see. Like we'll talk about it, but I don't have. So in looking at a lot of these incidents, so I'm just trying to gather. Okay. How many of them occurred? Like, what is that, first of all? And then of those different incidents, like, what are their features? And I'll tell you, for a lot of them, trying to get at the actual motives of the shooter is quite difficult, especially given that a lot of these were not high-profile incidents, and a lot of them seemingly occurred, like, almost randomly. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But a lot of them stem from, to me, like regular homicides where there's interpersonal disputes, someone is under stress or crisis, and then they snap. So
Thank you very much.
okay, more to come.